Hollywood in the 1950s wasn't all glitter and champagne. It was a battlefield of power, secrets, and dangerous love affairs. And right in the center of it all was Angie Dickinson. She wasn't just another pretty face. She was magnetic, ambitious, and unafraid to play by her own rules. On screen, she could steal a scene from legends like John Wayne and Frank Sinatra. Off-screen, she was linked to some of the most powerful men in America, even a president. But behind the dazzling roles and magazine covers, Angie's life was a storm of heartbreak, scandal, and choices that changed her forever. She turned down roles that could have made her even bigger. She walked away from love that others would have fought for, and she carried a secret romance that lasted decades. And now, at 93, she finally admits who the true love of her life really was. Before Angie Dickinson was lighting up movie screens and gossip columns, she was just Angie Brown, a sharp, restless girl growing up in a small North Dakota town. Born on September 30, 1931, in Culm, she was the middle daughter in a German Catholic family. Her father, Leo Henry Brown, wasn't a Hollywood mogul or a wealthy businessman. He was a newspaper editor and part-time projectionist at the local movie theater. He may not have realized it then, but he was giving his daughter a double gift: a love for words and a love for the movies. It was a childhood of contradictions. On one hand, Angie was raised in a quiet, conservative home. On the other, she was surrounded by the glow of movie reels and the smell of ink from her father's press. Stories, drama, and characters seeped into her life early, shaping her in ways she wouldn't fully understand until much later. When the theater burned down, the town lost its movies, but Angie didn't lose the spark. That fascination for the screen stayed with her. And when her family packed up and moved to Burbank, California, in 1942, the stage was suddenly set for her to chase something far bigger than North Dakota could offer. California was another world. Angie was just 10 when she arrived, but she grew up fast. She graduated high school at 15, yes, 15, after winning a statewide essay contest on the Bill of Rights. She wasn't just pretty, she was sharp, disciplined, and ambitious. While many girls her age were thinking about dances and dates, Angie was already standing out for her brains and confidence. After high school, she enrolled at Immaculate Heart College and later at Glendale College, where she earned a business degree. At the time, Hollywood wasn't even on her radar. She was practical, planning a stable career as a secretary or maybe even a writer, following her father's footsteps into journalism. But fate had other plans. In the early 1950s, Angie was working secretarial jobs, first at Lockheed's air terminal, then in a parts factory. It was routine work, steady, safe, and yet something about her stood out. She had a glow that couldn't be hidden behind a desk. A local beauty pageant changed everything. She entered, not expecting much, and came out second place. But more importantly, she caught the eye of a casting agent who saw something Hollywood was hungry for. That second place ribbon opened the first real door. Soon after, she was invited to appear as a showgirl on the Jimmy Durante show. Standing under those stage lights, Angie realized she wasn't meant for a life of filing cabinets and typewriters. She had presence, the kind that made people look twice, the kind that television producers immediately wanted more of. Angie didn't waste the opportunity. She started studying acting seriously, polishing her craft while taking whatever roles she could get. Early guest spots on variety shows and live television followed, little appearances that most people would forget, but for Angie, each one was a stepping stone. By the mid-1950s, she was starting to pick up real momentum. In 1954, she landed her first proper acting credit on Death Valley Days, a popular anthology series. The role was small, but the impact was huge. Suddenly, Hollywood insiders were whispering about the new girl with the smart eyes and natural charm. From there, things started snowballing. She was booked on matinee theater, City Detective, Gunsmoke, and even The Virginian. Westerns, dramas, mysteries, you name it, she tried it. Unlike many aspiring actresses of the time who leaned on looks alone, Angie proved she could carry a scene, adapt to different roles, and hold her own with seasoned actors. But Hollywood wasn't just about talent. It was about connections, and Angie was making them fast. Around this time, she crossed paths with a man who would later become her closest friend and, as many would speculate, the greatest love of her life, Frank Sinatra. Their initial meetings were casual, just another young actress crossing paths with an established superstar. but the chemistry was undeniable, and soon enough, whispers started swirling. Even before her big break, Angie's name was being linked with some of the most powerful men in Hollywood. That attention wasn't always easy to handle. She was still married at the time to Angie Dickinson, a football player she had wed in 1952. It was a marriage born out of youth and convenience, and though it gave her the famous surname she'd carry for life, it didn't last long. Hollywood had a way of erasing early relationships, and Angie was about to outgrow her first husband at the same pace her career was beginning to rise. By 1956, Angie had her first starring role in Gun the Man Down, acting opposite James Arness. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it showcased her in a way no bit part could. People were noticing her in a serious way now. And then came 1957's China Gate, a gritty Sam Fuller film that let Angie show a darker, more complex side. Unlike Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield, who leaned into the platinum blonde bombshell stereotype, Angie deliberately avoided it. She kept her natural honey blonde look, refusing to be molded into just another copy of Hollywood's reigning icons. That choice, bold as it was, helped her carve out her own lane, equal parts sensuality and intelligence. By the late 50s, Angie was steadily rising, but it was Rio Bravo in 1959 that transformed her from working actress to star. Cast as Feathers, a sultry gambler who goes toe-to-toe with none other than John Wayne, she held her own in every scene. Hollywood audiences were hooked. This wasn't just another pretty face thrown in for decoration. Angie had chemistry, wit, and timing, and she could make even the Duke look twice. Critics praised her performance, and audiences couldn't get enough. Suddenly, she wasn't just another hopeful actress fighting for screen time. She was the new Hollywood darling, and the men of Tinseltown couldn't look away. But Angie wasn't naive. She knew fame was a double-edged sword. For every compliment and headline, there was gossip. For every role she earned, there was a producer trying to control her image, a contract that dictated her choices. In fact, when Howard Hawks, director of Rio Bravo, sold her personal contract to Warner Bros. Without her knowledge, Angie was blindsided. She had signed up to be an actress, not someone's property. That betrayal stung, but she pushed forward anyway. Hollywood had tested her, and Angie passed. By the end of the 1950s, she wasn't just an actress with potential. She was a name, a presence, and a woman who had Hollywood's full attention. And yet, her story was only just beginning. Because while the spotlight was finally hers, Angie was about to step into the whirlwind of rumors, romances, and scandals that would define her career and her personal life. She had conquered the screen, but what came next would prove far more dangerous. By the end of the 1950s, Angie Dickinson was no longer just another actress hustling through bit parts. She had something that couldn't be taught: presence. Hollywood was starting to pay attention, but one role would transform her career forever. That role was Rio Bravo, 1959. Directed by Howard Hawks and starring John Wayne, Dean Martin, and Ricky Nelson, it was a Western packed with star power. Angie was cast as Feathers, a card-playing beauty who wasn't afraid to hold her own against the Duke himself. For most young actresses, standing across from John Wayne would have been intimidating. For Angie, it was an opportunity, and she seized it. On screen, she was flirtatious, witty, and magnetic. Off-screen, she held her ground with a cast of men who were already legends. Rio Bravo wasn't just another Western. It was a Hollywood classic in the making, and Angie was right there in the center of it. Critics raved about her performance, and audiences couldn't get enough. More importantly, Hollywood noticed. Angie Dickinson was no longer a hopeful actress. She was a star. But with stardom came expectations. Studios tried to mold her into the next big bombshell, pushing her toward the platinum blonde image popularized by Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield. Angie wasn't interested. She kept her natural honey blonde look and leaned into a different persona, one that combined sensuality with intelligence. She wanted to be more than a pinup. She wanted to be taken seriously. Her choices paid off. Through the early 1960s, she landed roles that proved her range. She appeared in crime dramas like Cry Terror. 1958, thrillers like The Sins of Rachel Cade, 1961, and romances like Rome Adventure, 1962. Unlike many actresses pigeonholed into one type of character, Angie played everything from femme fatales to strong-willed nurses. And then came Ocean's 11, 1960. The film was stacked with legends, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford. It wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural moment. Angie played Sinatra's wife, and the chemistry between them was impossible to ignore. Rumors swirled almost instantly. Were they just co-stars, or was there something more? In truth, there was. Sinatra and Angie's connection had started years earlier, but Ocean's 11 only fueled the fire. Hollywood insiders whispered, columnists hinted, and the public speculated. Angie never denied the closeness, but she also never flaunted it. What was undeniable was the fact that she had now entered the Rat Pack's inner circle, a level of Hollywood exclusivity reserved for very few. Her star only grew brighter. In 1966, she graced the cover of Esquire magazine in a now iconic photo shoot. Nothing but a sweater and pantyhose. The image was daring for the time, shocking even, and it cemented her status as a sex symbol. Decades later, the magazine would pay tribute by having Britney Spears recreate the pose, proof of just how powerful Angie's image was. But fame, especially in 1960s Hollywood, was a dangerous game. With every headline came new speculation. Angie's name became linked to some of the most powerful men in America, Frank Sinatra, of course, but also whispers of romances with John Wayne, Dean Martin, and even President John F. Kennedy. Some of it was true, some of it was, but in Hollywood, the rumor could be just as powerful as the fact. Meanwhile, Angie kept working. She appeared in Jessica, 1962, playing a midwife shunned by jealous wives. She shocked audiences in the gritty 1974 film Big Bad Mama, where she bared more than just her acting skills, sharing daring scenes with William Shatner and Tom Skerritt. Angie wasn't afraid to push boundaries, even in her 40s, proving she wasn't going to fade quietly into the background as younger actresses came along. But behind the glamour, Angie faced challenges that weren't as easy to control. Studios still tried to box her into roles that showcased her looks more than her talent. Directors often wanted her as the eye candy, a background beauty to decorate their films. Angie bristled against it. She wanted complexity, characters with grit and intelligence. Sometimes she got them, often she didn't. And then there were the men. Hollywood adored her, but it didn't always love her. The attention was intoxicating at times, overwhelming at others. To some, she was the glamorous starlet on John Wayne's arm in Rio Bravo. To others, she was Sinatra's off-screen muse. To the tabloids, she was a constant source of speculation. Who was Angie with? Who had she turned down? Who had she left behind? But Angie herself? She rarely spoke about it, preferring to keep the truth private. What the world saw was the glamorous Angie Dickinson, gracing magazine covers and starring alongside the biggest names in the business. What the world didn't see was the woman navigating the relentless machine of Hollywood, trying to balance ambition with authenticity. By the late 1960s, Angie was one of the most recognizable actresses in the country. She had built a career on talent and resilience, not just beauty, but the industry was changing. Television was beginning to rival film, and new faces were emerging. Angie could have faded into the background, another starlet replaced by the next big thing. Instead, she doubled down. She took on roles that surprised people, from thrillers to steamy dramas. She wasn't afraid of aging in Hollywood, a rare stance at the time. She embraced it, showing she could still command attention well into her 40s. And then, in 1974, everything shifted again. A single guest role on Police Story would catapult her into a new era of fame, one that would make her a household name, inspire a generation of women, and forever cement her place in television history. But while America cheered her on as a trailblazing cop, Angie's private life was beginning to unravel. Behind the uniform and the Golden Globe, there was a marriage under strain, a daughter who needed her, and sacrifices that would haunt her for decades. Hollywood saw the glamorous star, the tabloids saw the scandal, but the truth was much more complicated. And the next chapter of Angie Dickinson's story would prove that success in Hollywood always came at a price. By the early 1970s, Angie Dickinson was a familiar name in Hollywood, but her career was at a crossroads. She had the fame, the beauty, and the credibility, but television was beginning to outshine movies. Big screen roles were becoming scarcer, especially for women over 40. Most actresses in her position faded quietly into guest roles and talk show appearances. Angie wasn't ready to disappear. Her moment came almost by accident. In 1974, she guest-starred in a single episode of the anthology series Police Story. She played an undercover cop, a role that was supposed to be a one-off, but her performance was electric. The audience responded instantly, and NBC executives saw something bigger. They approached Angie with an offer, her own show. At first, she hesitated. A series meant long hours, grueling schedules, and less freedom. Angie valued her independence, and she wasn't sure she wanted to tie herself down. But then they pitched it differently. Don't you want to be a role model? Don't you want to be the first woman to headline a primetime cop drama? That was a challenge she couldn't walk away from. And just like that, Policewoman was born. The show premiered in September 1974, with Angie as Sergeant Pepper Anderson, an undercover cop working for the Los Angeles Police Department's Criminal Conspiracy Unit. The role was groundbreaking. At a time when women were still largely portrayed as sidekicks, secretaries, or love interests, Angie was suddenly the star, a woman who wasn't just in the action, she was leading it. The impact was immediate. Policewoman became a smash hit, not just in the US, but internationally. Angie Dickinson was now a household name, and her character, Pepper Anderson, was a cultural phenomenon. Within a year, police departments across the country reported an increase in female applicants. Women weren't just watching the show, they were inspired by it. And it wasn't just the viewers. The industry itself shifted. Without Policewoman, there may have been no Cagney and Lacey, no Charlie's Angels, no Bionic Woman. Angie's role had kicked the door open for every female-led cop show that followed. For her work, Angie won a Golden Globe and received 3 Emmy nominations. She had made television history, and she knew it. But as groundbreaking as Policewoman was, it also came with a heavy price. The shooting schedule was brutal, long days, endless takes, little room for rest. Angie later admitted that the grind drained her. "It's constant. It's really hard," she said in a 2019 interview. The fame was incredible, but it robbed her of time for film roles, personal projects, and most painfully, her family. She also bristled at the way the show sometimes handled her character. Despite being a tough, undercover cop, Pepper was often reduced to glamorous disguises and, in Angie's words, eye candy scenes. She grew frustrated with the recurring bath scenes, a gimmick where Pepper always seemed to get interrupted mid-soak by a ringing phone. Angie knew why they did it. Sex appeal sold. But she didn't like being boxed into that mold. Yet she played along because she knew the bigger picture. Every time she put on that uniform, every time she led a sting operation on screen, she was showing the world something new. That women could be tough, clever, and commanding without losing their femininity. Angie didn't see herself as part of the feminist movement, but the impact was undeniable. In fact, when asked about feminism later, she brushed it off. "I never felt the need for feminism," she said. "I never felt competition with men. When I was up for a role, I didn't compete with men, it was a role for a woman." That was classic Angie, direct, blunt, self-assured. She didn't see herself as breaking barriers, she just saw herself doing the work. But to millions of viewers, she was doing much more than that. By the time Policewoman ended in 1978, after 91 episodes, Angie Dickinson had carved her name into television history. But she wasn't done having fun with the role. She reprised Pepper Anderson in the NBC special Ringo, starring Ringo Starr and John Ritter, blending her TV persona with pop culture flair. She even parodied her iconic character in comedy specials with Bob Hope and later on Saturday Night Live in 1987. Her influence reached beyond entertainment. The Los Angeles Police Department awarded her an honorary doctorate for her impact on recruiting women. Angie, never missing a chance for wit, responded with a laugh, "Now you can call me Dr. Pepper." Even with all the acclaim, Angie sometimes looked back at Policewoman with mixed feelings. She regretted how much time it took from her film career and how the constant demands strained her marriage to Burt Bacharach. Balancing family, fame, and a hit show wasn't easy, and in the end, something had to give. Still, Policewoman gave Angie something no film role had ever delivered: power. She wasn't just a supporting character or a glamorous accessory to a male star. She was the star. She was the face of the show, the one carrying it on her shoulders week after week. And she did it brilliantly. The irony was that while America saw her as a fearless cop, Angie's personal life was more fragile. Behind the tough exterior of Pepper Anderson was a woman juggling heartbreak, motherhood, and the unraveling of a marriage to one of the most famous composers in the world. On screen, Angie was in control. Off-screen, life was slipping out of her hands. And as the cameras rolled and the ratings soared, Angie was about to face the toughest balancing act of her career, holding on to her family while keeping Hollywood at bay. Angie Dickinson may have been dazzling audiences on screen, but off-screen her love life was a storm of highs, lows, and sacrifices. For every glamorous romance whispered about in gossip columns, there was a private struggle no one saw choices that defined her as much as her acting ever did. Her first marriage was to football star Jean Dickinson in 1952. They were young, fresh out of college, and their relationship had the innocence of two people trying to build a life together. But Hollywood has a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and within a few years the marriage began to crumble. By 1959, Angie and Jean divorced, though she kept his name. Ironically, the name that would become iconic. That same year, Angie landed Rio Bravo, the role that made her a star. The timing couldn't have been more symbolic. One love story ending, another career story just beginning. But the true turning point in her personal life came in 1965 when she married legendary composer Burt Bacharach. At the time, Burt was at the top of his game, churning out hits like Walk On By and What the World Needs Now Is Love. Angie, meanwhile, was cementing her place as one of Hollywood's brightest stars. They were a golden couple, glamorous, talented, and endlessly photographed. A year later, they welcomed their daughter, Lee Nikki Bacharach, known simply as Nikki. But what should have been a perfect new chapter quickly turned into one of the greatest challenges of Angie's life. Nikki was born 3 months premature, weighing just 1 pound 10 ounces. Doctors warned that her chances of survival were slim. Angie and Burt spent those first weeks holding their breath, celebrating every ounce Nikki gained. Against the odds, she pulled through, but the fight left scars. Nikki grew up with health complications, including vision problems and later a diagnosis of Asperger syndrome. From the beginning, Angie knew her daughter would need far more than the typical attention a Hollywood parent might give. So she made a decision that few actresses at her level would have made. She pulled back from her career to be there for Nikki. Angie turned down roles that could have made her even bigger. Most famously, she rejected the part of Hot Lips Houlihan in MASH*, a role that went on to become legendary. Why? Because the shooting schedule would have kept her away from Nikki for too long. For Angie, family came first, even when it meant sacrificing superstardom. But while Angie was adjusting her life for their daughter, Burt wasn't always as present. His career continued at full speed, and with it came strains on their marriage. Angie admitted years later that she was crazy about Burt, structuring her life around him in ways that sometimes meant putting herself second. On the set of Policewoman, she famously refused to work weekends or long hours. Why? So she could rush home and cook dinner for her husband and be there for Nikki. But as Angie's star rose on television, Burt's career hit a rough patch. He was sued by longtime collaborator Dionne Warwick, and his songwriting seemed to stall. The balance in their marriage shifted. Angie was the one pulling audiences week after week, while Burt seemed to be fading from the spotlight. That imbalance, paired with long separations and different lifestyles, began to wear on them. By the mid-1970s, their marriage had quietly fractured. They didn't divorce, not yet, but they began what Angie later called living separately. She stayed in their Beverly Hills home with Nikki, while Burt spent most of his time at their beach house in Del Mar. Friends found it unusual, but Angie brushed it off. "We weren't divorced," she explained later. "And I was sure one of us, or both of us, would eventually decide what to do." That limbo lasted 5 years. During that time, both Angie and Burt saw other people, but they still considered themselves married. Angie admitted she didn't want to let go completely because despite everything, she still adored him. But by 1981, the marriage ended. Angie partly blamed herself. "I'd have left me too," she confessed, pointing to the long hours on Policewoman that drained her energy and left little room for romance. Burt moved on, eventually marrying songwriter Carol Bayer Sager, whom Angie believed understood him in a way she never could. There was no bitterness in her words, only a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes love just isn't enough. Through it all, Angie remained devoted to Nikki. Their bond was unshakable. Nikki inherited her father's love of music, playing the drums, though she never shared her mother's interest in glamour. "We're never going to be equally feminine," Nikki once told Angie, a line that made her mother smile. Angie respected her daughter's individuality, never pushing her to be anything other than herself. But the story took a devastating turn. In April 2012, Nikki passed away at the age of 40. She had struggled for years with her health and mental challenges, and in the end, the weight became too much. She took her own life in her Thousand Oaks apartment. For Angie, it was the kind of loss no parent ever recovers from. She rarely spoke about it publicly, but those close to her knew the grief ran deep. Bert, shattered, canceled all of his shows at the time. In a short statement, he described Nikki as someone who loved kitties, earthquakes, and everything science-related. Nikki had studied geology at Cal Lutheran University, earning her degree despite her vision problems. Her quiet determination was her legacy, but her passing left a hole in Angie's heart that would never heal. The tabloids often painted Angie's life as glamorous, full of love affairs with Hollywood icons. But the truth was more complicated. Behind the glitz, she was a woman constantly balancing ambition, loyalty, and heartbreak. And while her marriage to Burt Bacharach ended in pain, her heart was never truly his. Because through all the ups and downs, there was one man who remained the love of her life. A man who wasn't her husband, a man whose name alone defined an era. Frank Sinatra. For decades, Angie Dickinson's name was tied to powerful men in Hollywood, John Wayne, Dean Martin, even President Kennedy. But ask her who the true love of her life was, and she would answer without hesitation: Frank Sinatra. Their story began in the mid-1950s, when Angie was still a rising actress and Sinatra was already one of the most famous entertainers on the planet. At the time, both were married, Angie to Gene Dickinson, Sinatra to Ava Gardner. But sparks don't follow rules, and when Sinatra asked Angie for her phone number, she gave it to him without hesitation. From that moment, their connection became something far more than a casual Hollywood friendship. By 1960, their bond was cemented on screen in Ocean's 11. Angie played Sinatra's wife, and the chemistry was impossible to ignore. What audiences saw in theaters was only a glimpse of what was happening off camera. They weren't just acting like lovers, they were lovers. For the next 2 decades, Angie and Frank carried on an on-and-off romance. It wasn't steady, and it wasn't exclusive. Sinatra's life was filled with late-night parties, glamorous women, and high-profile drama. Angie, meanwhile, had her own marriages and commitments. But no matter where life pulled them, they always seemed to circle back to each other. Marriage was discussed more than once. By 1964, Angie admitted that the idea had been brought up, but she never pushed for it. "We were so comfortable with each other, it didn't seem necessary," she later explained. The truth was, she knew what marriage to Sinatra would mean, and she wasn't willing to pay the price. Sinatra was notorious for his late nights. He would stay out until dawn, drinking, gambling, holding court in Vegas lounges. Angie adored him, but she couldn't imagine building a life around that kind of chaos. She was independent, and as much as she loved him, she knew she would eventually resent living in his world full-time. Sinatra himself had his doubts. Angie remembered him saying more than once, "I'd never marry a movie star." Ironically, just a few years later, he went on to marry actress Mia Farrow. But Angie understood what he meant. Their romance worked because it wasn't tied down by paperwork or domesticity. They could come together, drift apart, and come together again without the pressure of trying to make it fit into a traditional mold. Angie once admitted she never wanted Frank to propose because she didn't want to be put in the position of saying no. She loved him too much to turn him down, and yet she knew deep down she couldn't be his wife. Despite the ups and downs, their affection never faded. Even when Angie married Burt Bacharach in 1965, Sinatra remained part of her life. He was there in the background, not jealous, not possessive, just a constant presence. Angie later said that Burt knew about her feelings for Frank, and though it complicated things, it was never a secret. To Angie, Sinatra wasn't just a man, he was a force. She described him as difficult, wonderful, brave, and foolish all at once. He could be stubborn, fiery, and unpredictable, but he was also deeply generous and loyal to the people he cared about. Angie admired his talent, not just as a singer, but as an actor. She believed he could do anything if he truly committed to it. Their romance lasted in some form for 20 years, and even after the romance faded, the friendship remained. Angie and Frank stayed close until his death in 1998. There was no bitterness, no lingering resentment, only affection and respect. Looking back, Angie often called Sinatra the love of my life. It wasn't Burt Bacharach, it wasn't Gene Dickinson, and it wasn't any of the other men she was rumored to have dated. It was Frank. He was the one who left the deepest mark, the one who always made her smile, even decades later. When Sinatra died, Angie's grief was profound. She spoke of him with warmth, remembering not the drama or the distance, but the laughter and the joy. "Just thinking about him makes me smile," she confessed in interviews. To her, Sinatra wasn't just a celebrity crush or a headline romance. He was the man who understood her in a way no one else ever did. And yet, their story is bittersweet. They never married, never built a home together, never shared the quiet domestic moments that come with commitment. Their love existed in hotel rooms, on film sets, in smoky Vegas lounges, and in whispered phone calls. It wasn't conventional, but it was real. Hollywood romances are often messy, and Angie was no different. But unlike so many tabloid flings that burned bright and faded fast, hers with Sinatra endured. Through decades of change, heartbreak, and shifting fortunes, he remained her constant. Even now, when asked about her past, Angie never wavered in naming him as the great love of her life. It wasn't the men she married. It wasn't the legends she worked alongside. It was Sinatra, the chairman of the board, all blue eyes himself. But Frank Sinatra wasn't the only Hollywood giant who couldn't resist Angie Dickinson. While her romance with Sinatra defined her love life, her on-screen chemistry with John Wayne created rumors of its own, rumors that still spark debate decades later. Because when the Duke himself called her one of the best actresses I ever worked with, Hollywood couldn't help but wonder, was there more to their connection than just movies? For years, Angie Dickinson's name wasn't just tied to Sinatra. It was also linked to another Hollywood giant, John Wayne. The two first crossed paths on Rio Bravo, where their chemistry was so palpable that even the critics couldn't ignore it. Normally, Wayne's tough cowboy persona didn't leave much room for romance. But Angie's feathers was different. She teased him, matched him line for line, and melted the Duke's usual stoicism into something audiences rarely saw: vulnerability. Rumors swirled almost immediately. Were they more than just co-stars? Hollywood gossip columns suggested as much, though neither Angie nor Wayne ever confirmed it. What is certain is that Wayne himself couldn't stop praising her. He once called her one of the best actresses I ever worked with, a compliment he didn't hand out lightly. Angie was equally fond of him, later describing him as adorable when they worked together, a word not often associated with the gruff John Wayne. Their chemistry was undeniable, but whether it ever crossed into romance remains one of Hollywood's lingering mysteries. Perhaps that's part of why the speculation never died. But Wayne was just one chapter in Angie's larger story. By the time the 1980s rolled around, her career had spanned 3 decades. She had been a rising star, a sex symbol, a groundbreaking TV cop, and a cultural icon. She had graced the covers of magazines, starred alongside Hollywood's biggest legends, and carried her own primetime series. Few actresses could say the same. And yet, Angie never saw herself as a trailblazer. She was candid about her choices, her regrets, and her contradictions. In interviews, she openly admitted she sometimes wished she hadn't done policewoman because of the toll it took on her personal life. She confessed that she didn't consider herself part of the feminist movement, even though her role inspired countless women to join police forces and demand stronger roles on television. Angie wasn't interested in labels. She was just interested in living her life. That life, however, was filled with contradictions. She was a sex symbol who joked about being exploited, once quipping, "Are my legs exploited? Well, that's all I've got to sell." She was a Hollywood siren who bristled at being reduced to eye candy. She was fiercely independent, yet she spent years structuring her life around Burt Bacharach. She rejected roles that could have made her bigger, because being a mother meant more. In the 1970s and 80s, she poked fun at her own image. She appeared on the Dean Martin celebrity roasts, laughing alongside legends as they teased her about her career and her relationships. She reprised her cop persona in comedy sketches, never taking herself too seriously. Even when the LAPD gave her an honorary doctorate for inspiring women to join the force, she cracked a joke, dubbing herself Dr. Pepper. But behind the wit and glamour was heartbreak. The tragedy of losing her daughter Nikki in 2012 cast a shadow that never lifted. Angie rarely spoke about it, but friends said the loss left her quieter, more reflective. It was the kind of wound even Hollywood's lights couldn't heal. Still, Angie's legacy remains undeniable. She changed the way women were seen on television, showing that they could be strong, complex, and commanding in roles traditionally reserved for men. She stood toe-to-toe with icons like John Wayne and Frank Sinatra and not only held her own, but often stole the spotlight. She redefined what it meant to be a sex symbol, proving it was possible to be glamorous and intelligent, desirable and respected, all at once. Today, at 93, Angie Dickinson's story reads like a Hollywood script, equal parts triumph and tragedy, glamour and grit. She was adored by legends, loved by Sinatra, admired by Wayne, and respected by millions of fans. But perhaps the most striking part of her story is how human it all feels. Behind the magazine covers and flashing lights was a woman making difficult choices, juggling ambition and love, career and motherhood, fame and privacy. When asked late in life about her greatest love, Angie didn't hesitate. It wasn't her husband, Burt Bacharach, though she had adored him. It was John Wayne, despite the undeniable chemistry. It was Sinatra. He was the love of my life, she admitted, smiling at the memory. Not because their story was perfect, it was anything but because it was real. Messy, complicated, unconventional, but real. Angie Dickinson's Hollywood wasn't the fairy tale the magazines sold. It was tougher, darker, more complicated. But in many ways, that's what makes her story resonate even more. She wasn't just a starlet who played the game. She bent the rules, took risks, loved deeply, and paid the price. And through it all, she remained unforgettable. As one critic once put it, Angie Dickinson didn't just play history, she made it. She broke barriers, lit up the screen, and left a mark that no rumor or scandal could erase. And if there's one thing her life proves, it's this. Sometimes the brightest stars aren't the ones who burn the longest, but the ones who leave a glow that never fades.